it is the 20th of January. And it was on this day in 1236 that Eleanor of Provence had her coronation in London. Now, she was married 6 days earlier on the 14th in Canterbury to King Henry III. They more or less made their way up to London, and the description of that day was very well noted by the most famous chronicler of that age, Matthew Paris. He wrote about, the reception that she received, and we know other aspects of this coronation. So let's talk a little bit about how it came to be that Eleanor was chosen to be the bride of Henry III. So John, you want to sort of take us through Henry's marriage history, or is it?
Yeah, well, kind of. It's. We probably need to go back a little earlier in terms of this relationship between County of Savoy and England, because it was a marriage alliance in a sense that was failed 50, 70 years or so earlier in the reign of Henry II. That Henry II had arranged with the Count of Savoy to have a very young John married to his daughter Alice, and unfortunately Alice died as a very young girl, and the marriage never took place. But there was already, around 70 odd years or so before Henry's time, there was this putative alliance between Savoy and England. But it's probably better to say not necessarily between Savoy and England as between Savoy and the Plantagenets, because as far as Savoy was primarily concerned, they were their neighbors across the Rhone. We have to remember, of course, that the Plantagenets in the time of the Angevin Empire, that's so-called, that they are the country to the west of the Rhone, and Savoy is pretty much the country to the east of the Rhone. So both of them had an interest, shall we say, in withstanding the advances of the Capetians to the north. And there was this alliance was the result. In fact, actually, this alliance that the Count of Savoy, he makes Henry II promise him a good deal of castles to John, which causes a great deal of fallout in the family. So the Savoyards were causing trouble even in the 12th century.
There must have been some connection even during Henry's minority, because I believe Thomas of Savoy, the Count, he asked Henry III or his minority council to give a benefice to his son William.
Yeah. There'd been, since this sort of failed marriage, so to speak, between Alice and John in Henry II's time, there had been ongoing discussions, of which we have some and not others, of a southern alliance against the Capetians. But what it really then goes into overdrive with Henry's failure to have the marriage in the north of France, which of course was kiboshed by Blanche de Castile.
Well, that's the important point here, because even during his minority or his first search for a wife, Henry's priority throughout his reign was to restore his family's eminence and power on the continent. So his first look for a wife was within the Holy Roman Empire, and that sort of to use as an alliance against the Capetians. And that failing, we see Henry suddenly, he wants to marry one of the princes of Scotland, the third, I believe, the third daughter. And the only way I can account for that is just that Henry, coming back from his failed expedition to Britain, he just sort of gave up on his continental ambitions. He's just gonna make do with what he has at home. And then right after that comes the Martial Rebellion, which completely changes everything, changes Henry's whole outlook on his barons, his church, everything. So as John just mentioned, he tried to seal a marriage alliance in to the north of France, or basically neighboring Normandy. Of course, Blanche of Castile, the regent, then she said, "No way is that going to happen."
That's right; it's too close to Normandy.
So how did Henry settle on Eleanor?
It's the second taxi off the rank as well, isn't it? Because Eleanor's elder sister Marguerite had married in Paris, and the Savoyards had seen, first of all, that the way to secure their protection was to have a marriage alliance with Paris. But when Guillaume, the brother, had gone up to Paris to the wedding celebrations, he'd been sent away almost with a flea in his ear by Blanche de Castile again. So there was going to be no
Blanche.
great advantage to this relationship between Marguerite and Louis. And when Henry came a calling, they of course think that, okay, there is a plan B, which is the relationship to resuscitate this relationship with the Plantagenets. And so Guillaume goes off and so forth. In fact, as you probably all know, that this letter from Henry to start to think about this marriage, to ask for this marriage to Eleanor, it's interesting. It doesn't go to the bride's father. It goes to Uncle Amadeus, Uncle Amadei. So you can see straight away that it's Savoy that's behind this relationship. Provence is not really involved in that degree to the same
Well,
to the same
that was
amount.
that was rather amusing itself. I believe in that letter, Henry told the Count, well, you know, I have already married another woman, but don't worry, I'll take care of that, because Henry did in fact went through the legalities of marrying oh gee, what was her name in
Jean de Pantois?
yeah, there
Jeanne.
we go.
Jeanne.
Right. The future mother of Eleanor of Castile. Yeah. And so there was some kind of ceremony performed, but because they were related within the degrees, it of course fell away when he didn't get a dispensation for it. So, but I also think that Henry saw a very good opportunity here, because he's always out to somehow reestablish a foothold on the continent, you know, beyond the confines of Gascony. So since Marguerite was in France, then maybe he could slip
The
in
next
and, you
factory
know,
off the rank.
yeah, you know, get Provence for himself. So anyway, that comes to that. There's a very amusing tale, of course, about Henry and the dowry of Eleanor. Anybody want to go for that?
I think what Henry was at one stage prepared to take Eleanor for nothing, wasn't he? I think I should remember.
Right. Well, he
Yeah,
thought,
as
or
the story goes, anyway.
well, he presumed he could get 20,000 pounds for her, like he had to pay for his sister Isabella for her marriage to Frederick. He wants to make sure he's got all his bases covered, so he sends off 5 letters. He has I think it was 20,000 pounds, 15,000 pounds, 10, going down, 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 and the messengers leave. Then he starts to panic that he's tempting fate, and he dashes off another Pony Express to catch up with them and say, look, bring her back, dowry or no dowry. So Eleanor comes. She has that great progression through France. Her sister Marguerite is there, and then she comes to England.
Isn't this one of the earliest? I'm not sure whether it is even the earliest account of a coronation of
Yes.
a queen.
Yeah.
Yeah, as far
I
as
think it is,
I know, it
isn't it?
is. Yeah.
Certainly in that detail, it's very, very, I mean, it's quite
Yes.
remarkable when you read that account of Matthew Paris and you looked at Charles' coronation more recently. You could almost imagine that Matthew Paris, what he was describing, was what we saw in Westminster Abbey. It's changed a little and changed in some of the detail, but remarkably, you're looking at almost the same picture, which, when you consider we're talking about almost 800 years later, that's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I want to show everybody this well-known drawing of Henry under the canopy when he carried the vial of the Holy Blood, which would have been in 1247. So you can see we have the canopy. This would have been the same with Eleanor. She would have walked under such a canopy. There would have been a cloth leading up to the door of the abbey.
And this will be a 12-year-old girl at this point, yes?
Right. So that's a good point. So we can bring up this other famous sketch that Matthew made. So this showing supposedly probably the marriage, or the representation of the marriage, Henry giving Eleanor the ring. You can see by her very demure stature, almost boyish like, that she's probably about 12, maybe no more than 12 or 13. And compare the size difference with Henry, who who at this point was 28 years old.
Imagine at this time what it was like for these girls, that they were transported to a far off part of Europe as part of some grand geopolitical machination, and their entire life you're whisked away from your parents, you're whisked off to England, and you suddenly imagine the whole coronation of Westminster Abbey. That really must have been quite some.
Well, yeah, I mean, Eleanor never
Beyond
saw Provence again, and Marguerite, the queen of France, you know, next door to Provence, was only there twice. She went home twice, both going on crusade and coming back from crusade. But other than that, she never went. I even think Blanche of Castile, she never went back to Castile. These, you know, these young girls, they leave, they never go back.
Too busy keeping an eye on Louis, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, but
It's funny seeing the picture of Eleanor being so small in that picture, because I seem to remember David Carpenter suggesting that of course, you know, the Lord Edward was quite a tall man, wasn't he? And there was this discussion about where he got his height from, because you know, Henry was only of average height, wasn't he? And David thought that possibly that Eleanor actually was quite a tall woman,
right,
and that's where Edward the First got his height from.
right.
But I don't know what you thought about that.
No, definitely. I mean, you know, she comes from, you know, descended from some of these mountain people. So, you know, maybe giants of the mountain. We don't know, but yeah, definitely would probably had to have come from Eleanor's side. Yeah.
Their height, Darren, their height, I don't think is ever remarked upon to my knowledge. But what you do get over and over again, talking about her mother, thinking about her brothers, even Peter of Savoy, is the word keeps getting used, of beauty, of elegance, and so forth.
Right. A Boniface of Savoy, wasn't he known as Boniface le Bel or something like that?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Good-looking clan.
Yes, they were. Yes, and I'm sure that mattered enormously in 13th century politics as much as it does now. Actually, I'm sure that was the case, and no doubt Simon de Montfort was a very good-looking chap as well.
So she's 12 years old. She probably would not have attended the celebrations afterwards, you know, when all these barons and knights tended to get drunk or have fights or whatever, because we do know that Simon got into a squabble, you know, which is quite, I mean,
it's unusual.
He was arguing with Roger Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk, over the right to be the king's steward at the feast. And of course,
interesting, the father-in-law wasn't at the marriage either. Ramon Berenguer had stayed down in Provence, and we probably just paused for a moment to imagine poor old Ramon Berenguer. There he is with 4 daughters. We talked about the beauty of this family. 4 daughters, all hot-footing it off to be the the queens of various parts of Europe. But if we imagine how Ramon must have thought, and I believe it's the case, is it not, gentlemen, that Berenguer's coat of arms is still in Westminster Abbey today?
yeah, could be.
It might be. I think. I don't know about that.
I think if you look at there's the number of shields that Henry had put up in the ceiling there. I believe that.
Well, he left Simon's there. Well, anyway, back to Simon though. So of course he would have wanted to exercise this function as the steward, because he's being seen with Henry. He's his new man, and Roger tried to claim it from him. So we already see Simon fighting to protect what he believes are his rights and his privileges and so forth. And but it would have been interesting for Eleanor and her party, I think, to meet Simon, because he grew up in Carcassonne. His father was the famous crusader there. The Albigensian crusade did not immediately affect Provence, but the entire region around it. So they certainly would have known that family very well.
Yep.
And I often wonder how they might have communicated, because I definitely think that Simon, as a boy growing up in the south of France would have picked up some of these the local dialects down to the
The
Provençal.
Occitan.
Yeah, so
The Occitan. I mean, with the party, of course, you have two figures that are going to be very important in the court. You have, of course, Eleanor's uncle Guillaume de Savoie, but you also have a cleric, her clerk of Guillaume de Savoie, which, of course, is Pierre d'Aigueblanche, who is going to be the Bishop of Hereford. So we have, as you say, that there's Eleanor brings an entourage,
right.
and the entourage that's going to become quite important.
Well, that's a good introduction there. So I'll call him William because it's easier for me to say. So he's more or less leading Eleanor's party to England. And I think he must have known, or it must have been some communication that he was going to stay on. Henry certainly wanted him for his counsel, for reasons I believe go back to this Martial Rebellion. Henry was very eager to have somebody of William's caliber there. Also because he was pushing through reforms of the sheriffs and the finances. And that was going to, engender a lot of hostility amongst them, because these English guys are always fighting each other about something. So he probably figures you get an outsider like William, a sort of corporate man of the world, and he could help him push that through.
Guillaume has a reputation in Valence for reform and for financial reform. So certainly he chose his man well.
Right. And but you made an interesting point there earlier, John, about rain England, because it's at this winter time, 1236, that the skies just open up, and London is inundated with water and flood. So Westminster Palace becomes flooded. People have to get around there on horseback or by boat. Presumably this happened after the coronation, but Henry had already summoned a great assembly to London, not just, of course, for the marriage and the coronation, because his brother-in-law, King Alexander, was there, but also he wanted an assembly to codify a new set of laws, which became the Statute of Martin, right? So, and this, because all the laws got mixed up following Magna Carta and also the rebellion, and so they needed to get things sort of squared away. So it was supposed to presumably be at Westminster Hall. They ended up moving it down to the Priory at Martin, which is, I believe, modern day Wimbledon, that area around there. And this is a very significant event because we see Parliament, or we see a gathering of judges, barons, the king, great lords, all gathered together to create a new set of laws. So here we see Parliament sort of having a legislative function for the first time. And this was also the same year when the word Parliament was given to these assemblies. So I kind of like to think that this was the first Parliament, if we're going to say that. So Eleanor would have been present. William of Savoy, I'm sure, was in attendance, probably gave some guidance, about what laws are like on the continent and so forth. And so William stays on in England. So what does that mean for England? Because Eleanor's only 12, so she's not going to have any real influence at this point.
It's worth just reminding at this point, because this is the role that Peter of Savoy will take on. We're jumping ahead of ourselves, but Guillaume isn't going to last long in England. But effectively, he's there as Eleanor's wingman. So as far as the Savoy family are concerned, he's the protection. He's the one who's going to make sure that everything's okay for her. So yeah, that's his role as far as from this side of the channel is concerned. And as you say, Henry sees an able administrator and an able reformer of finance, because that's his reputation, as we said, down in Valence. So yeah, there's that moment then when he suddenly takes up all of these roles, and much to the consternation, shall we say, of the locals again.
Well, you've studied these this
Well,
issue, these Savoyards and stuff. So why did why did William create such anger in men like Matthew Paris? I mean, he really despised him.
Mm.
well, I think your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I think it's a sort of it's a standard trope, isn't it? Really, as they say, Matthew Paris. I mean, I think that as far as I can see, I mean, the um, William of Savoy's uh, I mean, in many ways, it was very successful, really, because I mean, I think there's a sort of a power vacuum, isn't there, at this stage? I mean, the sort of factions of Hubert de Burgh and Peter de Roche had fought each other to a standstill, and I think Henry was there's a sort of need for some sort of new political dispensation. And I think that as I remember rightly, I think William of Savoy was very good at bringing people together.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, he was pretty good at working with various political organizations. I mean, for example, you know, the opposition that you know, any opposition that came against William, I think some of the leading figures were then simply brought onto the council. Wasn't, you know, isn't it John Fitzgeoffrey? I seem to remember was one of the people who may have created some trouble against the new William of Savoy regime, and yet he's then brought onto the council, and then it's turned into a sort of, if you like, Henry III and Savoyard loyalist after that. And I think this ability to sort of bring these people together is more the Savoyard manner rather than anything else. And that's why, of course, they survived. They did well to start off with. So you have this reform, the reissue of Magna Carta, don't you, as well?
Well,
All under
yeah,
the aegis of William of Savoy.
but
Very, very important. You know, they knew what to do, I think.
yeah, but
Going
going
back
back
to
to the
just
point about why he was so disliked by people like Paris, I wonder if it's just if we look back to 1231-32 when there was that guerrilla action against foreign clergy that Hubert de
Yes,
Burgh
it
was
could be
behind. I believe
Crusades.
William was one of the targets. His benefices in England were targets of these, wild horsemen in the night. And I think they got a lot of sympathy from Paris's predecessor, Roger Windover, and I think Paris is bringing that over. They don't like these foreign clergymen in England.
Well, yes, I agree with you. They have this sort of it's what you could call prejudice, isn't it? You know, what is understandable, isn't it? And
Well, I mean,
but didn't seem to
I
make
like
any
to think
difference.
I like to think that this is the price that the baronage of England has to pay for the fact that the church that has to pay that they supported Louis, or a French prince on the crown of England. They supported him. Now, it took the church to get rid of them, to solidify Henry's position. Everybody likes to think it was William Marshall and he saved the day, but really it was the support of the church that ensured Henry's survival. And okay, and now they want, what is owed to them, which is namely, okay, we're going to, take some benefices for our clergy. I mean, this is basically the deal. I think that was.
I think you're right. I think you're right, Darren. There is this hangover from the decades earlier. What's remarkable at the moment, I'm doing this research into Edward's reign and the role of grandson. Grandson largely follows on from these people. There is much more of an acceptance in Edward's reign for Savoyard being very deeply involved, and basically we've outsourced for about 70, 80 years. We've effectively outsourced foreign policy to Savoy. But there is much, much less resistance to that in Edward's time. Perhaps Edward is a very strong king, and perhaps, you know, you wouldn't argue with Edward at all. If it would have been a brave man so to do. But nonetheless, I think it's that this is this 20-year period or so before Eleanor comes to England, there is more of this residual xenophobia, so to speak.
Yeah. So
yeah. Yes, but Edward the First is much more canny about patronage, isn't he?
Yes.
He doesn't give lots of marriages, and Otto the grandson, who might, I think Prestwich said, really merited being made an earl. He never was, of course. So they did all right, but they didn't get these staggering patronage that Henry III dished out to this. So the second generation of Savoyards don't do quite as well.
But Michael, they got the power. I think when you see the power that grandson had effectively to negotiate treaties on Edward's behalf,
yes.
that would have been known. That would have been known to the other noblemen that they had this power and they had the ear of the king to that level. Yes, they weren't getting the land that they got earlier. So I think there is, to Darren's point, there is a latent xenophobia that Eleanor comes to when she comes to court that is there in the 1230s, 1240s that isn't there to the same extent in the 1280s, 1290s.
Right, and that even applies to the Lusignans. I mean, under Edward's reign, everybody the melting pot had been achieved. So this idea that they were foreigners when a lot of them were even born in England. So I think that finally goes away. I think a lot of this griping about foreigners being in England is just about money. You know, it's who's going to ride on the gravy train of the church. And so Eleanor is growing up, becoming a mother. And what is William? So William, he's helping Henry pass through these reforms, but then something spectacular happens in 2 years later, January of 1238. Does somebody want to go for that one? All right, I will. Oh, this was the Montfort marriage, all right? Yeah, so...
Oh, yes.
So Simon de Montfort married Henry's sister, Eleanor. This caused a great outcry, maybe for someone not quite familiar with these politics. Why did the Montfort marriage cause a great outcry? You want to take that, Michael?
Well, first of all, it was done almost secretly, wasn't it?
Right.
Wasn't that a great system? And we were never quite sure whether Henry knew about their relationship and agreed to it before it went ahead or afterwards. I think people think that Montfort was a bit of a chancer, wasn't he? Because he wasn't really in line to be Earl of Leicester. I think he had to get his older brother to cede his rights to him. And then he got this staggering marriage, really. And another thing about it, Eleanor had sworn an oath of celibacy after her first husband died. So it was all a bit odd, really. But she was obviously a very striking woman, and one with real Plantagenet go about her.
As you say, it was done in secret because Henry knew that he could never get approval for it. I mean,
yeah.
We know that the discussions about the marriage of his sister Isabella to the Holy Roman Emperor, these took 3 days of discussion in council. So there was probably a lot of argument against it because of the cost or whatever. And I think Henry believed he had no chance to get such a proposal through the council now, even with William of Savoy on there, because by this time, Simon has been in England for about 7 years. We know that Simon twice went to the continent to try to arrange a marriage for himself with these older countesses. Now, both of them were more or less situated on the border of France, and because Simon by that point was a baron of England, the steward, these proposals never had a chance from the start. And I think that Henry more or less put Simon up to it. He said, go over there, try to get yourself a marriage, sort of his way of harassing the French monarchy, sort of keeping the pressure on them. and basically saying, you know, look, when you come back empty-handed as you will, you can have Eleanor, because he later accused Simon of seducing Eleanor. So he believed that she had already broken her vow of celibacy with Simon. He knew what was going on. So he's sort of putting all this together to his own advantage, because most people won't give Henry credit for doing his own thinking, but I feel that he knows exactly what's going on. He knows exactly what he wants. So this marriage takes place in his private oratory, in the king's chamber, and there was just this great outcry. His brother Richard was against it, the marshals again. We don't really know William of Savoy's position, but I believe he had to leave England, or he left England right after it. And I wonder if that was, he had two things in mind. One, he was trying to get a promotion within the church. I think he wanted to become the Bishop of Liege or something. And also, if he was going to later
Lyon, wasn't he the Bishop-elect of Lyon?
Valence.
No, Lyon as well. I may be wrong about that, but I think so.
I can't remember now.
No, I think maybe his brother, the youngest brother, was the Archbishop of Lyon.
Yeah, I might have got them confused.
What's his name?
He was looking for an archbishopric on the continent. I know that. Yes.
John.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you know, there was some sort of power struggle going on, wasn't there? I mean, Montfort was one of a group of young aristocrats in Henry's court. He was a sort of one of the, you know, an acquisition in terms of his looks, his courtliness, his continental connections, his potential sort of military prowess, and so on. But I think he's sort of, as you said, really sort of he's trying to carve out a career for himself in England. And I mean, to what extent Henry went along with this, I don't know. But, you know, it's typical of Henry's court, really, that things sort of happen which may or may not be under the king's control. And what you've got is a kind of a struggle between the various pressures around the king going on. And Eleanor's position only becomes really powerful after she produces an heir for Henry. And this is an uncertain period, again, when Henry could sort of have opted for another set of favourites in the sort of Montfort circle, because, of course, they become very important, don't they, all of a sudden in the late 1230s. Is it John de Lacy's the other one, and that sort of group?
Right, and John de Lacy was also part of the affinity of Ranulph of Chester, and who was more or less Simon was his brother.
That's right. Yes.
So yeah, they were all connected like that. But I really think that also, I guess I should mention, I think there was another great marriage at this time, not in secret, of course, was with Helen, the widow of John the Scot, daughter of Llewellyn. Henry gave her in marriage to Robert de Quincy, a second son. And the Quincy's and Simon were fighting at that time over their division of Leicester. So I kind of wonder if Henry is sort of balancing things here. You know, he's got this terrible fight between the Montfort and the Quincy's. So he gives Robert de Quincy Helen as marriage, and he gives his sister to Simon. It would seem to me that that's more or less how Henry operated. He's always trying to satisfy everyone in this regard. Anyway, William of Savoy. So now he's there because of Eleanor. Henry, he wants to keep William on his council. He wants to keep him as an advisor because William has connections. He's definitely very, very talented, urbane official. I think in many ways like Peter de Roche, so he wants to make William the Bishop of Winchester following the death of Peter de Roche. So how did that turn out?
Yeah, it doesn't end well. The chapter says no.
Well, yeah, they say no, and they call William a man of blood. So this more or less indicates that William had a soldierly career.
Yeah.
One of those warrior monks type, which of course Peter of Savoy would have been had he stayed in the church.
They all, and they'd met. We discovered they almost certainly met. William and Peter would have been on campaign in northern Italy, and there were English knights along there too, with John Maunsell, who'll come into the story later, no doubt. That almost certainly these guys all met up in northern Italy. So yeah, they were known as, going back to Bishop Odo of Bayeux, these were warrior monks. They weren't necessarily just monks.
Well, William wasn't too sad about the chapter refusing him, because he already had good prospects in becoming the Bishop of Liege with his and his brother Thomas was, I believe he'd already married into becoming the Count of
Flanders.
Flanders, right? So, but you know, we had this sort of outbreak of hostilities between the Empire and the papacy, and William was going to lead actually the papal armies when he suddenly died.
Yeah,
I believe now, probably, you know, I think some Englishman was accused of poisoning him, but
it's unknown. We've no way of knowing really what's happened there. Certainly the likelihood is he's been murdered rather than he's passed away of natural causes.
He was about what, 39 or 40?
Yeah.
And so Henry was, you know, terribly grief-stricken. Eleanor too, probably. But no problem. Henry has a plan B. You know, William's gone. Thomas of Savoy is a good connection because he, as we said, he's the Count of Flanders. But now the next member of the brood arrives.
We think it's either Eleanor or Thomas sends for Peter and says, "Look, we've got a gig for you in London."
Yeah.
And so Peter hotfoots it up to England. In fact, not only that, as we all know, that Peter was given the honour of Richmond before he'd even come to England.
Well, it had been in William's custody.
Yep. So this sudden arrival of Peter in England had been sort of 6-12 months in the making.
You know, Henry gets a lot of grief about that he's giving this great honor to the Savoyards, but in fact, it belonged to the Dukes of Brittany. But Peter of Dreux, he betrayed Henry one time too many, as he did everybody else. And so Henry took it back into crown hands. So what's Henry going to do with it? Now, most people say, well, you know, collect the revenue from it, you know, live off the revenue. But again, Henry is not like his father or grandfather. He's not hoarding cash. We know that his entire 56 years on the throne, he was constantly living hand to mouth. So, and he's got to keep these people with some reward. So he basically, you know, gives them Richmond. Though I believe in Peter's case it was for life, but they ended up
was originally, and then it was extended. They have them so effectively what's happening here now is that Peter is the new William, as we've said, but again, but so from the English perspective, Peter is the new William in terms of the counselor for Henry. But from the Savoy perspective, he's again now the protector for Eleanor. So Eleanor is, she's still a very young girl. She still yet hasn't produced an heir for Henry. It's a precarious position, obviously, for a queen who hasn't produced an heir. So again, it's kind of handy to have your uncle alongside to make sure everything goes okay.
Well, but Eleanor certainly had it easier than her sister Marguerite in France. I mean, I think she went 10 years without producing a child.
It's very interesting, even in the very earliest grant of Richmond to Peter, it actually states specifically that Peter can grant it to any of his brothers or kinsmen, bequeath it. So it does look as though they are really intending to dig in for the long term there. I mean, it's quite a remarkable clause, I think, in the charter, and of course as I showed in my article, I mean, it's exactly the sort of legal detail that Peter would insist on having in any grant from the king. But it does sort of show, I think, that they were in for the long term there.
Mm.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that we know that Peter comes to England. He's probably around 40 years old, but he's never been knighted. But of course, he had a career in the church before then.
Yes,
And I really think he's just waiting to, he wants to be knighted by a king, so he's more or
yes,
less waiting
yes.
for his chance.
Yes, and oddly, he goes didn't have any heirs, I think, either. No male heirs anyway at that
No
stage.
male heir, just one daughter.
But I
Yeah.
think you brought up one point in one of your papers that it wasn't just about Peter's connections and the good advice he gave in political terms, but also ordinary living. Didn't he remark that they at Windsor Castle they should not keep the dung pile next to the children's quarters?
Yes, yeah, well, that wasn't one of mine, but that's David Carpenter's anecdote. Yes,
Okay.
but it is typical of Peter. His grasp, I think. I mean, Peter obviously is a man of great intelligence, and that he understood that the path to power is secured not simply by military ability, but your ability to get on with people,
Mm.
and to charm and so on. And I think very, very much he had all that from the very word go. I mean, there was a lot of, there was a certain sort of short-term opposition to Peter, which could have been gathered round Richard of Cornwall, for example, when he returned from Crusade. But Peter got out of it. He offered to resign all his offices, but he sort of the opposition sort of was charmed away, and Matthew Paris remarks at that point, that Peter had real ability. So I think that you can see something of why some of these people were able to get away with what they did. I mean, de Montfort himself had that charm as well, but I
Right.
think at this stage, of course, they were really trying to sideline de Montfort in order to establish the Savoyards.
Well, that's a excellent point there because we see Simon's downfall coincide with right before
Yes,
Peter's arrival, and that
yes,
downfall is connected with more or less the loans that he took out that
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
which I guess the Savoyards had probably extended to him, and Montfort, of course,
Well, they
claimed
bought
security for
it's
them.
Thomas Peter's brother, Guillaume's brother, had bought this loan, and so
Right, but
yeah,
I think that was planned. I
yeah,
kind of have a feeling they, as Hugh said, they wanted to more or less sideline Simon. I mean, Henry had
it
given
was a
him his
position.
sister,
Yeah.
he had given him Leicester and so forth. Simon had more or less served his purpose,
Mm.
and Simon
Uh,
really
Darren,
did not have the connections to the continent that the Savoyards had. So Henry was more or less betting on a new horse.
Darren, I will have to go now. I'm
Oh,
sorry. But we're
all
going
right.
to
Well, Michael, we hope to have you again for another chat.
This would be
Nice
great.
to see you
yes.
again,
Thank you.
Michael.
All right. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.
Bye bye, Michael. I'm going to have to go myself in about 2 minutes.
Bye.
I think my supper's ready.
What is supper, Hugh? Very quickly.
What is supper?
Yeah.
Well, we're having a very nice beef stew, so
Oh,
Well,
so she's been slaving over this. So I better go in a minute anyway.
are we invited?
Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, I've got to go. All the best now. Bye,
Okay,
chaps.
bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
so we'll have to take that. We take that from there. We've got, I guess, as far as Peter of Savoy. So we got up to about 1241 or so. Yes, in this reign. So I don't know how many of these sessions you want to do, Darren, but
Well, let me
Eleanor's
ask
in
you.
England for a long time.
Well, at the time that Peter came to England, there was, of course, this more or less mobilization going for the crusade. Richard of Cornwall, Simon de Montfort, a lot of the barons were going to leave on crusade. and Henry wanted Peter on his council because he had nobody left, basically.
Yeah.
But what about afterwards? Was there any sign that Peter was ever going to go on crusade or to take the cross? Or
There were talks of it, but nothing ever very serious, as far as I can ever make out. I don't think it was ever a realistic proposition. He did go on campaign, as we know, with Henry on quite a few occasions. So it wasn't necessarily he wasn't military, but crusade, no.
I think even before the landing in Gascony, Henry had more or less, or he sent Peter on a mission to Provence.
Oh yeah, to try to
for the alliance,
to try to get this Southern Alliance,
Right.
Yeah.
And Louis tried to capture him.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. They were all, I mean, that was the whole point of this relationship with the Savoyards, as far as Henry was concerned in the beginning, was this so-called creation of a Southern Alliance. You have Toulouse involved, and you have Savoy, and to a certain, by implication, Provence by marriage. But unfortunately, it all comes to naught. And
Peter was not just forming this alliance, but also helping to arrange a marriage between Richard of Cornwall and Sancha, right?
That's right. Of course, we then it's almost like sort of a 2-2 draw in a football match. We start off with Marguerite going to the House of Capet, then we have Eleanor coming to the House of Plantagenet, then it's 2-1. We have Sancha coming to the House of Plantagenet, and finally, in a sense, the Capetians win all by taking the last of the daughters, Beatrice, who's got the land, and they get Provence, which is much to the chagrin, shall we say, of the Provençals even to this day, that they end up becoming part of France.
That was part of these hostilities between the Empire and the Papacy, because it was at that time that the Pope hightailed it across the Alps to escape Frederick's grasp, and he more or less told the Capetians, hey, if you give me, something similar to sanctuary, I'll give you the youngest daughter in marriage, and Provence can be yours.
And Provence with it. And of course, you have this rather curious treaty, which happens just after this, 1246, of various bits of Provence being enfiefed to Henry, which again is a bit of this the papal problem again, because papal empire problem, because it's a very smart bit of diplomacy on Amadei's part, that he enfiefs this land in the Alps across to Henry. This is the land through which the emperor might march to get to the Pope in Lyon. And of course, Amadei, instead of being the meat in the sandwich, he can say, to the emperor, don't worry about it. Go and talk to the King of England if you want passage.
Right. He's sort of washing his hands of the problem.
Yeah. It's not my castle. You need to march past it. Now belongs to Henry. Go talk to him. And because it doesn't happen anywhere. But it just is an interesting example of how the local story can get mixed up with the whole pan-European geopolitics of it.
But that treaty was also part of this attempt by Henry to marry his nobility into these houses of Europe, because I believe he got the castles, but also one of the Amadeus's granddaughters, or
and that's going to get you. That's going to really get you into lots of things in terms of the Kingdom of Sicily, because when Charles d'Anjou ends up with Sicily, becomes King of Naples and Sicily.
This is in 1268-69. Yeah.
Well, this sort of period, and the daughter, one of the last daughters of the Hohenstaufens, marries the King of Aragon, and of course, when you have the Sicilian Vespers,
what goes around comes around. I mean, whatever. But this was a point that I wanted to make with that's connected with the arrival of Eleanor of Provence in England, is that, as I mentioned earlier, so Henry had this rebellion instigated by Richard Marshall and his affinity. It was really confined more or less to South Wales, but basically Henry was humiliated at every point of it, and he could see that his bishops his barons were either neutral or on Marshall's side, he really could see how isolated he was within his own people. And of course, he had to capitulate. He had to get rid of Peter de Roche and all the other foreigners at court. Well, more or less remove them from his council. And from that point, I think that Henry decided, all right, I need to remake England anew.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Henry had a different view of what his role was and what being King of England meant at that point. It didn't just mean England; it was the Plantagenet dynasty, and it was the Plantagenet lands. And you're right. When you were talking about what he saw he's trying to do at this point, we need to see Henry's whole being at this point through the prism of trying to get back his father and his grandfather's lands.
Well, lands, but also you might say influence and dignity and so forth. I mean,
it's personal. It's personal,
right? It's
though,
personal, and also people fail to see the point of Sicily. You know, they think it's this crazy scheme. Contemporaries thought so. It's thought so today. But when you look at what Henry's dealing with, because you know he needs to make an alliance with Castile. That's how he secures the southern border with Gascony. So he needs that alliance, and that alliance comes at a price, namely that Edward needs to be endowed with this huge amount of land. Henry gives him everything he has and more, maybe that he even doesn't have. But this essentially means that the second son, Edmund, gets nothing.
Yep.
So, I'm sorry, Hugh is gone because in his the charters of Peter of Savoy that he collected, I believe there was something about Chester. Henry had bought out the heirs of Chester, the Earldom of Chester, and that was going to go to Edmund. He was going to be the Earl of Chester, but of course, having to you know, give Edward all his land, Edward ended up with Chester as well. So Henry and Eleanor are thinking, you know, look, we're just being given Sicily by the Pope. You know, this will be Edmund's endowment, more or less, if it works, of course. And of course, the Savoyards played a role in making that happen. Of course, it didn't for a variety of reasons.
And then it's quite interesting. They were one of the earliest people though to back out of it. Peter backs out of that at a relatively early time.
Well, because Thomas was captured. I mean, that completely changed their focus, even Eleanor's focus. They were all trying to free Thomas. So that more or less doomed the venture right there. When Thomas marched into I think it was Asti and got himself captured.
It's quite remarkable when you see effectively, you know, the way the modern world works in terms of sanctions against the country if it oversteps, and take the Russians with Ukraine and whatever. The poor old Asti and the poor old Torinese, when they captured, but boy, did they suddenly regret it, because you have France and England and all these countries all around Europe suddenly impounding all your merchants, putting you under embargo and interdicts, and it was like, okay, maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
Right. I mean,
Sicily is a fascinating story, isn't it? The whole thing from beginning to end.
Sure, but it's basically just a continuation of what Henry's trying to achieve. And I think also on a more spiritual side, he completely supported his brother's attempts to win the crown of Germany. He even sent envoys, you know, to scope out the situation, to make sure that everything turns out well. So I kind of believe that Henry is seeing himself as King of England, his brother Richard as the King of Germany, and his son, Henry's son, Edmund, as the King of Sicily, more or less three Plantagenet kings ruling Europe at that time. I mean, that would have had great spiritual meaning for Henry, because he was more or less wedded to the idea of the three kings and the Trinity. He writes about this in his speech to the Pope, explaining the Reform period. So definitely, that's what Henry was after. Unfortunately, he's a king of people who've had enough with foreign ventures. You know, they're more interested in you know, England is booming at this time. There's money everywhere, and everyone wants to get in on this money. And
the remarkable thing we were talking about this earlier here actually is that the thinking about Magna Carta, and you talked earlier about the birth of Parliament. The birth of Parliament and the whole growth of Parliament and Parliament you've talked about when Eleanor and Richard were looking after Parliament. It's a layers of an onion. It's a development slowly over a period of time, and basically it's a slow sapping of power from the monarchy and a slow aggrandizement of power rested in Parliament. And that's been the story of sort of 600-700 years, but you see it beginning in this time. And this is all a consequence, fundamentally, of Philip August taking all this land from John. John has to suddenly start taxing everybody to the high hilt. And it's at this point that they suddenly go, hang on, sire, if you want your lands back in France, don't come asking us for the money. Thank you very much, sunshine.
With the issue of Parliament, I mean, this was the result of Henry's minority. I mean, you had these two factions, the English faction against the foreign faction, who more or less saved England for the English, while the English faction was trying to give it to the French. So out of that squabble grew this idea of Parliament, and that, you know, you have to take counsel and make decisions together and so forth. But it really didn't take off until after this rebellion by William Marshall. I mean, to me, this was the turning point, the major turning point of Henry's reign. It really deserves more studies and books and so forth. But anyway, it will be up to someone. So we're coming to the end of our time again.
So 1240, we're up to 1241. If you want to continue with Eleanor, we'll have to do a
yeah, certainly. Let's make we'll find some topic for next month, and I'll look for an anniversary, you know, to give us the occasion.
Well, that was useful. No, thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed it. And as John and I just said, we're going to try and get something going again another time to keep the thread going, because it's a very long, complicated history, but a very good one. So
okay.
Anyway, have a good week, a good night, everybody, and hope to see you again soon.